Today, I'd like to introduce you to a passionate African millennial who's had enough of the status quo. Driven by frustration and a burning desire for change, he believes that the world is at war with Africa, and that if the continent's 54 nations fail to unite by 2030, the repercussions will be both dire and irreversible. I'm Martine Dennis. This is Africa Here and Now. Welcome, NNAMDI CHIEKWU.
Hello, Martine. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you.
Now, I've just described you as a millennial who's angry. What's enraging you, Namdi?
Yeah, thanks for the description. I'll say two things are enraging me. And I believe I feel a range of emotions beyond anger. And perhaps I can voice some of those emotions. I feel a certain amount of disappointment, fear, a little bit of feeling overwhelmed as well regarding the amount of work that needs to be done on the continent. And so the foundation of all of this is a realization that our parents, when we were younger, I'm 42 years old, and when we were younger, they'll have the saying that, one day will be okay, and this generation will be part of the change, etc. And I realized that it's not going to be okay. In fact, I realized this while I was in Guinea. And I'd been living in Guinea for a while, and I experienced a coup in the country in 2021, and I'd seen Guinea kind of develop, and some socio-political and economic factors lead to that coup. And I just realized that not only is it not going to be okay, but we've reached our last chance as Africans, as civilizations. And that last chance is 2030.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you're bringing us right to the nub of it, and that is that you have written a book. You feel so strongly that you've written this book, Africa on the Precipice, and you've given a cut-off date. You've said that Africa has got to sort itself out. It's got to unite effectively and become a federation of states by the year 2030, or else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The premise of the book is that we're in this kind of battle of civilizations that humanity has always been in. And if we're being frank about it, we Africans have been losing in this battle of civilizations for the last 500, 600 years, since the Middle Ages. And I document this in the book, like, where did we kind of begin to go wrong? And so we are now at a cutoff point where we face three major issues. So one is that we're behind in three major socioeconomic revolutions, which is the agrarian revolution, industrial revolution, digitized revolution. Now you have the energy transition, and you have the AI movements as well. And so to be behind in one of those economic revolutions is difficult. To be behind in five is fatal. It's impossible. And we have to accept that hard truth.
All right. So Africa is in a dire situation, behind on every metric that you care to mention. What is the solution then?
The solution, as I see it, and by the way, these are very difficult solutions. These are solutions that are not only difficult for Africans, but difficult for the world, because effectively what I'm calling for and what I'm working towards is a new world order. And nobody likes a new world order because it disrupts the agenda of everybody else.
Well, I think we're actually experiencing a new world order anyway, aren't we? Right. So why not throw another one into the pot? So, I mean, you are talking about Africa uniting. I mean, Africa is, they agreed on a continental free trade area in 2018. It's still not fully implemented. So how long do you think this would take for Africa to unite fully?
So again, first of all, how long will it take? We, in my opinion, or from my perspective and analysis, we have 5 years to do it. And again, I want to qualify this concept of uniting. So before uniting, the first thing that needs to happen is that we need to recognize that what we call African countries and governments are really colonial contraptions, right? And these institutions were never intended for African innovation, liberation, let alone dominance, right? And so the first thing that needs to happen is that all these governments and multilateral institutions have to be collapsed. Now, there are two ways that that's going to happen. It's either you're going to see the kind of coups and potential bloody revolutions that you're seeing, or what I propose in the book, which is that we need to go through a process of technocratic revolution, where we sit down within countries and we restructure ourselves, and we have some very difficult discussions, and also a process of healing and understand. For instance, I'll take Nigeria, for instance. Are we going to stay together, or are we going to, separate ourselves into nation states, etc.? But at the crux of it is a realization that the way we've been governing ourselves is foreign to us. These are not the socioeconomic models that we evolved with, and therefore it's no surprise that we continue to have the negative results that we see in Africa.
All right, let's go back to the initial proposition, and that is your anger, and your demographic. You are a millennial. What you as a group say really matters. I mean, I checked with the World Economic Forum. Millennials represent 65% of Africa's purchasing power at the moment. You are the biggest group of voters on the continent. So what your group says really matters. Do you think that your group generally feels enraged, feels perhaps impotent, feels disenfranchised?
It's the entirety of the emotions that you've just mentioned right now. And then there's a small group like me who, I think saying I'm enraged is an understatement. I'm apoplectic with rage at the baby boomer and Generation X who really failed. They have to accept that. They really failed. When you compare their cohort to others in, for instance, in Southeast Asia, etc., who delivered a certain foundation to their millennial generation, you have to look at what did that generation deliver to us, right? What did our parents deliver to us? It certainly isn't a liberated Africa. It certainly isn't an Africa that is well positioned geopolitically to have any kind of relevance in the 21st century. And in many cases, we've regressed. And so when you compare that generation to what I would call the independence movement generation, who actually delivered somewhat of a free Africa, right? We weren't completely free because we know after colonization, neocolonialism came. But that generation didn't take up the fight. And the question is, why didn't they take up the fight? Partly because they didn't have the courage. They wanted to embed themselves and ingratiate themselves into a Western-led world. They had no confidence or esteem in terms of what can an African-led world look like. And that's why I come up with this concept of Afro-hegemony that I bring into the book, that this millennial generation, we're not interested in having, a say or a seat at the table. We want power. We're not, and that's what you're seeing with some of these coups that are happening in West Africa is that, to hell with sitting on the sidelines and, maybe be given a role, etc. We want to dominate affairs and we want to have global relevance as well.
And where does this, the concept of democracy fit into this then? Because you've alluded to maybe a more traditional style of governance for Africa. I'd like to know what that consists of and whether it works in conjunction with or opposes or doesn't even give any kind of reference to what we consider to be Western style democracy, which has been foisted, I think you could quite easily say, on the continent since independence.
Right. So I think it's important for, the audience to understand, and I outlined this in the book, is that before our extended or expanded interaction with the foreign world, starting in the 15th century, 16th century, we Africans had exceptional social, political, and economic systems of governance and development that just objectively speaking, when you go and study it, were just wonderful. If you, for instance, take a look at the Yoruba in Nigeria, I'll give you an example. I'm Igbo, but I study and I relate to all cultures in Nigeria. If you study, for instance, various forms of governance and the cosmology in Yoruba culture and concepts like Ifa and so on, they are absolutely objectively amazing. And so the problem that we have as Africans is at a certain point in our history, we got beat up. We had a few folks come from the outside world, foreigners, who beat us up, took our lunch. And all of a sudden, we let go of everything else that we had. And that's completely understandable, right? But just because we lost at a certain point in our history doesn't mean that we're losers and doesn't mean that all the knowledge and intellect and systems of economic and political governance that we had were irrelevant. No, they were actually fantastic. And I believe the world can actually learn from them. So Afro-hegemony is a process of kind of going back and readopting those systems and hopefully evolving from there.
Right. In order then to reach this cutoff point, this deadline, it sounds a bit like a doomsday 2030. What needs to happen now? What needs to start now?
Like I said, so there has to be a technocratic revolution across the continent. And let me define a technocratic revolution. So a technocratic revolution has a plan for the next day. It isn't a question of going out and protesting and, bringing down the government. Because one thing we also have to accept is that 95% of our population is compromised. Not only our population, but our institutions, etc. So what do I mean by that? I mean that there's a good bit of our population that doesn't have the requisite education or positive indoctrination to even be relevant in a 21st century economy. We see that, across the continent. The other thing is that we've been afflicted by the scourges of consumerism, capitalism, and religious indoctrination and so on. So we have to do that work. There's before I talk often on political science and economics, etc., but there's also a psychological bit of work that needs to be done here where we need to down our tools, first of all, and go through a process of deliberation, discussion, restructuring, and healing to understand where have we been, where are we, and where do we want to go? And each country and each ethnic group has to do that.
This episode of Africa Here and Now is sponsored by the Sudan International Contact Group, a coalition of Sudanese political leaders and civil society members who are committed to a peaceful democratic transition in Sudan. The SICG is working towards inclusive dialogue and long-term peace for a better future for all Sudanese people. You mentioned that the vast swathe of people on the continent who haven't really got the skills or the equipment, if you like, even to compete in this fourth industrial revolution as it's known. But what about those elites who are embedded in place? They're not going to happily give way to this technocratic revolution that you're suggesting, are they?
Exactly. And so I think this is what's different about this millennial generation and this voice. We're no longer asking. The coups in West Africa and various other places in Africa show that because they're millennial-driven coups. And so there's a generational shift that has to happen. We're not this idea or this African tradition of respect to our elders and the wisdom of our elders. Well, the millennial, the Generation X and boomer generation, I apologize to say it, haven't shown very much wisdom. And at the end of the day, respect has to be earned. And when we millennials look at the Africa we've inherited, we're saying, why are we listening to you? You people are lost. You don't have a direction. You don't have a plan for us. So we are going to take the power. Now, we're going to either do it the easy way or the hard way. And so the hard way is kind of this, the coups that are happening, which is the military violence kind of thing. And then the easier way, I think, is a technocratic revolution is let's have a discussion about this, but we're no longer going in this direction, or we're no longer going to accept the status quo as it is today, right?
How much buy-in do you need for this in order for it to work?
That's an excellent question. So one of the realities that I've confronted in this journey with this book and this concept of Afro-hegemony, which again, by the way, Afro-hegemony, just to give it a little bit more definition, Afro-hegemony is this idea, is this movement that we Africans have to aspire to global custodianship. And the reason why we have to is because the West, and quite frankly, the East, cannot be trusted, in my opinion, to manage geopolitical affairs in the 21st century. As far as I see it, Western management of geopolitical affairs has been poor, absolutely poor. And the evidence of this is look at the state of our planet, look at the state of inequality, economic inequality in the world. It's certainly been poor for us as Africans. And so with the advancement of technology that we have, the fact of mass proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, etc. And I look, and quite frankly, in contemporary times, what's happening in Gaza today? Because let's not forget, and this is, for me, is a litmus test of global leadership, because out of all the various countries and peoples and nations, etc., who were the ones that actually took a principled stand in what's happening in Gaza today, which in my opinion is a genocide? It was the South Africans. The Western world is contributing to it. The Eastern world is kind of ambivalent about it. We were the only ones, and maybe you could argue the Houthis, etc. But we were the only ones that took a principled stand. So if I was an alien coming to this planet and I say, who would I hand the baton of power to? It has to be these Africans, because we are, for good and for bad, the civilization that has this accommodative DNA that can live and let live.
What you're saying sounds incredibly reasonable, given the moment in time that we inhabit right now, because of the upending of the international order that we've become rather comfortable or uncomfortable with, you could say, in the last since the last war. So this is often depicted as a moment which Africa needs to seize to turn things around, to make itself have much more say in terms of the international order. You're chiming in with that very much.
Right. So you just to make sure I close the loop on the question that you asked about, well, you and what army is going to do this, right? That's effectively the question. So the reality that I face is that the vast majority of us in Africa, whether it's the baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, Gen Z coming behind us, lack the belief in our ability to get there. I have to admit that to myself. And that's obvious. Why? Because we've accepted, to a certain degree, we become comfortable in oppression. And to another degree, we've been losing for so long that we forgot that we were winners, right? And so what I am relying on is a critical mass of us that do get it. And there's plenty of us like that. I am one of them. And I call this the new African variant. And it's important that the world take note of this new African variant, because we're quite different in three ways. Number one, like I said before, we're no longer interested in what anybody has to say. We're going to do what we want, when we want, how we want it. Number two, we're no longer asking for a seat at the table. And we're no longer asking for a share of power in your multilateral institutions. We're interested in dominance, not only in the African context, but globally as well. And the world must, and then the third thing is that we're willing to go as far as anybody else has and further in the achievement of that objective. You see, this African variant, we've been around the world. We've been learning for the last 500 years, intellectually, spiritually, you name it. We know what the world knows, but unfortunately, the world hasn't taken the time to learn what we know from our culture, from our African DNA. We can speak your languages, we understand your technologies, and more importantly, we can organize and coordinate ourselves much more easier today than we've ever been able to.
Well, as one of those rather disappointing late boomers, I emphasize the late boomers, we were given an immense amount of hope, a decade ago, with the Africa Rising narrative, with the African Renaissance, which actually did not really materialize. Why should we believe in what you're putting forward as the new African variant? And we need to get onto this, the Africa Defence and Advancement Federation, ADA.
Yes, yeah.
We need to get onto that.
Yeah, we need to discuss that. So first of all, this Afro-hegemonist movement, the African variant, or the fundamental, why should you believe in that versus the whole African Rising narrative, is because it's not based on lies. It is based on reflection. It is based on a spiritual recognition, and is based on an honest and sincere desire for a generation of Africans to advance. The Africa Rising narrative was based on lies. It was a few bunch of elites, as well as the foreign cohorts, who concocted this narrative in order to raise money and enrich themselves. That's the difference this time around, is that we are operating from a place of truth. And from truth, you always get better results. That's number one. Now, regarding this ADAF, the Africa Defense and Advancement Federation. So I want to make a very important distinction in what I'm saying in terms of this concept of one Africa. So in the discourse of, as far as African political governance right now, you have kind of two ends of a spectrum. So there's those folks who say we should be united, we should have one president, etc. And believe it or not, there are those who believe that we should have ethno-linguistic states, right? That ethnic groups should govern themselves. And part of the problem that we face in some African countries is that we've been all cobbled together because of colonization, and we're different people. So you can't just cobble together France and Germany and Spain and tell them, go and make it happen, right? So we have to recognize that. So what I'm proposing is a medium path, right? Which is that we have to respect and encourage the indigenous socio-political systems of governance of ethnic groups. But then at the same time, we have to coordinate and collaborate on certain issues at a certain level. And this is where ADAF comes in. So ADAF for me is a supranational entity where I am advocating that we aggregate 5 powers, right? And the reason why we should do this is because these 5 powers typically cause the macroeconomic shocks that we see in Africa. And if we can mitigate the macroeconomic shocks, we now have the enabling environment for development. So those 5 powers are monetary and fiscal policy. We need to coordinate that at a supranational level. Centralize the military. If we centralize our military, we're not going to have the issues that we're seeing, for instance, in Sudan and Ethiopia and so many places. So we need to have a centralized military so that powers that be don't abuse military power. The third item is international diplomacy. We have to speak as one voice, I believe, because for the longest time, it's been divide and conquer. And we have to sort that issue out in terms of divide and conquer and have a general policy. And then the fourth is intracontinental development as well, right? And then governance. We have to have a situation where it shouldn't cost $15,000 per kilometer to build a road here and $25,000 per kilometer. There's a lot of fluffing going on there, right? So those are the 5 powers that I believe should be aggregated at the supranational level, and then let everybody else sort themselves out and govern themselves as they please. And that's where ADAF comes in. ADAF is going to be that entity.
Right. So are we talking then about a single currency, for instance? Are we talking about Morocco in the north of the continent being part of the same grouping as Namibia in the south of the continent? So vastly different in terms of geography, in terms of culture, in terms of history. Are we talking about them being part of one unit?
So you've touched upon something that's actually a very sensitive topic that I touch upon in the book, and I'm not afraid to do that. This vision of Africa that I talk about, and I need to specify to sub-Saharan Africa, because I believe there's too much of a wide gap between sub-Saharan African culture and North African culture.
Okay, and so in this new dispensation, are we doing away with the African Union? Are we envisaging something more like the European Union, where there is a single currency, but there are multiple languages, multiple cultures, all apparently rubbing up along together rather harmoniously? Is that how you picture it?
Yeah, so 100% we're going to get rid of the African Union, because the African Union, out of all the compromised entities in Africa, that one is extremely compromised. First of all, it has no teeth, it has no power, right? And then third of all, it's funded a good about 33% of its funding comes from external circles. So it's never served our interest. So the African Union goes, and replacing that is ADAF, the Africa Defense and Advancement Federation. And ADAF will have teeth, will have powers. And all ADAF says is that on these 5 items that I previously identified, we have to be unified. Everything else, do as you please and negotiate that amongst yourselves.
All right. Now that brings me to what you're wearing, which, as I say, is very attractive indeed. I wouldn't mind one. But what does it signify to you? I mean, this could be straight out of Black Panther, the movie.
No, so I call this the ADAF signature look, right? So whenever I'm on mission. So by the way, I'm just another guy from civil society who sees himself doing his civic duty to his continent and his people. So whenever I am on mission, so to speak, talking about these issues and topics, I wear the ADAF signature look, and you can get it in different colors, but this is what ostensibly ADAF members will be wearing in the future.
Right, thank you. I expect one in the post. Now, I've also read you refer to ADAF as a sacred entity.
Yes.
which just made me wonder whether we were straying into cult territory.
No. So principally, ADAF is a technocratic entity, right? It is a technocratic entity that is dedicated to the defense and advancement of Africans, sub-Saharan Black Africans. And why I say it's a sacred entity is that in African, part of our Africanity is always a reference to some element of spirituality. For us as Africans to devolve and to separate our technocratic institutions to our sensibilities towards spirituality, I think is to take away our Africanness. In our culture, there are certain things that are sacred. And this is part of the problem in the world today, is that the world is being led by nations and countries who nothing is sacred for.
Now, I'm just thinking, we mentioned earlier that you would need a substantial amount of buy-in for this. What sort of response are you getting, given that there is so much abject poverty on the continent, people basically wondering where their next meal's going to come from? How many people are likely to be persuaded by your argument?
100%. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. Maybe about 5% of us are ready. Maybe about 5%. Out of what, the billion of us in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe about 5% of us is ready. Initially, that realization, and the reason why I say 5%, because, in every group of people that are oppressed, so to speak, there are those who are complicit, those who are submissive, and then those who are resistant. What I've realized is those who are complicit and those who are submissive, we can't change that. The damage, the structural damage to esteem, to confidence, to knowledge base is too deep. But there's a 5% critical mass that I believe are ready. And as long as we coordinate ourselves, we organize ourselves, I think we'll show the world something it's never seen before. And so part of my mission over the next 5 years, specifically in Nigeria and across Africa, is to say that 5%, we need to get to work. And the book is the blueprint to get to that work that needs to be done. So I'm undaunted. I'm realistic about our chances, but I realize that if we don't do it, we're going to be gone by the end of this century. I can tell you that. That isn't an opinion or an analysis. That is a message to our people. History is replete of civilizations that have disappeared. Native Americans, Carthaginians, the Aborigines, the Afro-Argentines. And the common denominator amongst all of them is none of them knew when their end was beginning.
NNAMDI CHIEKWU, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, that's it for this edition of Africa Here and Now. Thank you for watching. Remember, to please the algorithm, you need to like, subscribe and share. NNAMDI CHIEKWU's book is called Africa on the Precipice. You can get it on Amazon, or you can also get it as an audiobook. I'll have some more details in the show notes about the book. Now, you can also get Africa Here and Now on the major audio platforms, and we've built up a considerable archive of interesting conversations on the website www.AfricaHere&NOW.com. There you'll also find some smart commentaries on some of the major issues of the day. Have a look. We're on the socials. You can email me, martine@AfricaHere&NOW.com. Do get in touch. We recorded this on May the 27th, 2025. Our original music is by Enric Adam. Anne Busby is our producer. Tevin Sudi and Simon Elliott put it all together. My thanks to NNAMDI CHIEKWU, and of course my thanks to you for your company.